Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Altispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour to be a part of the program. It is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host, delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. So one thing I wanted to address right off the bat, I have now been playing with Orbital panels for 2 weeks, and it's been absolutely incredible. It's been kind of a rapid succession. Got them involved in my house, got them installed, and got the family using them. And now we've scheduled our first professional install with them. That is to say, we're going to go sell some Orbit panels and put it in for a paying client to use to give control back to them where they previously had none. And this is going to be something interesting I'm going to showcase on the program, because the house was built to be a smart house. So it was one of these houses that when the construction company put it on the planet, however many years ago, they said, the future is going to be smart homes, so we're going to build the house as a smart house. Now, if you're building a house as a smart house, obviously, you wouldn't go with the traditional way of wiring light switches. That is to say, you run the wires to the room that the light is in, then you touch the wires together and the light on the ceiling turns on, you disconnect the wires, they turn off. No. That's so elementary and simplistic and old-fashioned. No, the new way, put all the switches, all the light switches in the entire house in the electrical room where the breaker panel is. I'm sure that sounded like a great idea however many years ago when they built the house. The problem became they put in this proprietary light system, and the proprietary light system runs on this controller that has a battery. And if the power goes out and the battery dies, which it did, the system loses all of its programming and you have to start over. And it costs a lot of money to have one of these integrators come out and reprogram the system. So we are starting slow, but we are going to pull one at a time those circuits from this proprietary lighting system, put it into some Shelly control modules, and then we're going to control them with Orbit panels. So I'm meeting with the electrician tomorrow night to go to do a walkthrough and figure out how that's all going to go. I will keep you in the loop, as I imagine you would. I imagine there'll be some people that will be interested in that. Amid legions of Debian, Ubuntu, and indeed Arch derivatives, the Orion project offers something different, a desktop-focused distro based on Alma Linux. The result is a slightly odd mixture of older components and some helpful desktop tweak adjustments. If you have modern hardware and want the latest software, this isn't for you. But if you want to install for years at a time without doing much in the way of manual adjustments, it just might appeal. So this comes to us from the Register. We'll have the link for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com, all the yeses to this, and twice on Sunday. So this is a project that is based on Alma Linux 9.3. It originally appeared in November of 2023 and was not on my radar, to be honest with you. I have, for a long time, placed a tremendous value in commercial desktop operating systems. That's a difficult nut to crack. Everybody's doing servers. And everybody does servers well, but servers are not really all that hard to get right on Linux. What's hard to get right on Linux is a desktop Linux operating system. What's harder yet to get right on Linux is a desktop Linux operating system that is catered towards a business or professional environment. Here's why. The vast majority of businesses, if they're just going computer shopping, are not winding up on Linux boxes. They're winding up on Windows boxes. They're winding up on Mac OS. And it's only when people like me go into those places and say, hey, have you considered a different route? Would you consider using this over that? Let me demonstrate the value of this over that. And then all of a sudden they'll turn around and go, oh yeah, that makes way more sense. But absent somebody like me asking those questions, they won't arrive at those conclusions on their own. Additionally, there isn't a lot of money to be made in the desktop Linux sphere. Sure, if you're working for a college or you're working for some sort of scientific firm, those places will use Linux because it's the de facto standard in those industries. But even businesses in which their primary operating model is just to open up Google Chrome or Firefox, browse to a given site, and stay in that all day long, they still will not oftentimes organically wind up on Linux. And when they do, it's by way of things like Chrome, Chrome laptops, Chrome desktops, what have you. They look at it, they identify that their need, you typically see this a lot in conference rooms. Well, I just need to be able to get to XYZ site. A Chromebook will do me well. $200, we install it, it's good, right? Part of the problem is there isn't a company to fall back on. At least with Chrome, you know it's backed by Google. And even though Google doesn't have what I would consider to be stellar support when it comes to the Chromebooks, if you have a product support and you need something, that they'll be there for that. But if you don't know how to do something in Chrome OS, there's no way that I know of to pick up the phone, call the hotline, and say, "Hi, Googs, I have a question about how to do X, Y, or Z." Nobody there to answer that question. And so the support part of it comes into play here. Because of that, I think a lot of places have shied away from using Linux on the desktop. So Orion Lime specifically, is a desktop twist on an already industry standard Linux derivative. So you have Red Hat in production, or you have Alma in production. It works well. There have been places that have tried to use Alma Linux as a desktop operating system. It works okay. But again, you're fighting upstream. And I remember, this is many, many years ago now, but probably 2010, 2012 circa, I was working with a client and they asked me about running Linux on the desktop. And at that time, we bought Red Hat licensing for these computers. Now, Red Hat never told me no when I called them to ask. They never once said, no, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, won't do that. Nothing like that. But it was made clear to me on a number of different occasions. You know why VLC doesn't work? Back then, does probably now. Well, it doesn't work because we didn't really focus on Linux on the desktop. We're really focused on servers. And so there was a way to add a repository and add it and all the things, but it wasn't a first line answer. Well, Orion Lime is a first line answer to desktop Linux. Additionally, the company is putting out support, so they have a place that you can go. If you go to orionproject.org, you're able to click on Desktop Plus, and they have a help page. Everything from how to get Orion up and running, the applications which they distribute via Flatpak. They have guides on using Bluetooth, on getting connected to the internet, and then they direct you towards the forums so that you can continue to get help. They have a team that's going through and putting all of this out and putting releases out. So I really like the idea. I really like the fact that they have Lutris, Steam, Bottles, all of those desktop-like things are there. Their goal is to provide the most packages and dependencies that aren't typically included in enterprise Linux, and they're working to make sure that the user experience is better by the day. They focus on performance. They focus on an optimistic gaming experience. And overall, they're focused on stability. So this is kind of the fork in the road that you get to with desktop distros, right? Your choice is you either go with stable, known, good quantity, but you're not getting the latest of the latest. You're not getting the latest and greatest. And if something doesn't work, you're going to wait a while before a fix comes and lands. This, to me, seems like it could potentially be the best of both worlds, insofar as you get the operating system that you know has rock-solid stability, but then you're layering this app layer on top via Flatpak, so you're always getting the latest version of the applications that you're using. Quote, after installation, you must install the Flatpak repository file in order to get your applications from the built-in software center. Don't forget to reboot for the changes to take effect. To me, this is a really great idea. This is a really potentially awesome experience for companies and or places that want to use Linux on the desktop, but want a company to fall back onto to do that. You can learn more at orionproject.org. Of course, I'll have a link for you in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. Ike Doherty is back in the news with Serpent OS, a distribution gearing up for its first alpha release. And 9to5 Linux has a first look at some of the new features and changes being incorporated since the pre-alpha version. Now, Ike Doherty was kind enough to share with them the details about the Serpent OS alpha release, which promises to enable support for the Framework 13 laptop, support for installing Flatpak apps from FlatHub by default, and then some improved support for AMD Ryzen systems and considerably more hardware support. I got to be honest with you, I struggle to find who the target audience for Serpent OS is exactly. I understand when you're talking about serving the market of business users that want a stable Linux desktop, and there aren't a lot of choices in that category. I'm confused as to exactly who the target audience is. Quote, my belief is that the tool quality labels are separate from the distro itself, and while we want tooling to improve, we can't lock the fate of the OS to it. So I'm accelerating both sides, and one doesn't determine the other, said Ike Doherty. So it sounds good. What I'm reading on paper is great. I like some of the screenshots that I've seen. And again, if you're in the market for a desktop distro to jump to, might be something to consider. I am drawing attention to it mainly because if Ike Doherty is working on it, it's going to be a really cool project. I don't know how long he'll continue to work on it. I don't know how long it'll continue to be on the planet, but it's definitely something to feast your eyes upon while it's here. And finally, in desktop Linux stuff, Cosmic Alpha. So the Linux hardware vendor System76 has announced the release and general availability of the long-awaited Pop! OS 2404 LTS. So if you haven't been following along, the latest version of Pop! OS features their Cosmic Desktop. Cosmic Desktop is a Rust-based desktop environment. It's in its alpha version, so it's really right now for early adopters, but System76 has been very clear on their messaging on this. What they're looking for is to put it onto the planet and have people tell them what they like and what they don't like. They believe they have a pretty good idea of what makes a good desktop distro. They believe that because every time they sell a computer, they send out a survey to ask the person who purchased it, what do you think? What did you like? What did you not like? Where is our opportunity for growth? And they've taken that feedback over the 10 plus years they've been in business, and they've consolidated it into, we started making computers that were tied at the hip to Ubuntu. Then Ubuntu kind of ripped the rug out from under them when they left Unity and went over to GNOME and forced System76 to re-implement and fix a bunch of stuff in GNOME to meet their customers' expectations. As they skated further on down the road, they, I think, grew tired of this idea that, well, GNOME is an extension-based desktop environment, and so you just need to add all the extensions that you want. But wait, hold on. If an extension doesn't work, or if there's a problem, or if it crashes, well, that's not GNOME's fault because it's an extension-based desktop environment, you see, and so they're not responsible for the extensions. And I think at some point they stopped and went, look, here's the deal. We have real human beings that are buying our computers on the other end, and they're not interested in this. What they're interested in is having a curtailed experience that can be delivered out of the box. That's what we're trying to do, and we're starting to have to swim upstream to do that. So they cleaned the slate, they started over and said, what do our customers want? And it's been a really fantastic journey to follow from the standpoint that it doesn't just target the almost fantasy-like new Linux user, right? I don't know that that user exists. I've certainly bumped into those people, but they're typically using Linux at my behest, right? You've gone in there and said, hey, have you ever considered trying a different operating system? Well, I don't know much about that. Well, here, let me show it to you. Oh, that's kind of cool. All right, great, awesome. Run with it for a while, see what happens. And sometimes you get them hooked and sometimes you don't. But the reality is, I rarely have people that go, listen, I don't know anything about tech. Don't really care anything about tech, but I want to try Linux. That is not a conversation we have typically, right? System76 does have customers that are working in the science space, that are working in the computing space, that are working inside of research, that are working inside of software development. And those people absolutely want Linux on their desktop and will do business with System 76 because they know that company has a track record of supporting people who want to run Linux on their computers, and they'll build computers designed to do that. They were doing that before the frameworks of the world, before the Dells of the world, before it became popular to offer Linux as an alternative. They were doing this. And so in collecting all of that feedback, they looked and said, okay, our customers want a couple of things. One of the things is tiling. One of the biggest nuts that I have personally been able to crack is you can either do something with tiling or you can do it without tiling. Now, without tiling, the best experience to date has looked something along the lines of KDE with window rules. And so you can get some of the tiling aspects in there, but it also is still a regular desktop environment when you want to do that. The other option is to go full tiling, which I've done. The problem becomes when I want somebody else to use my computer. Literally every other person I work with at Altispeed Technologies becomes unable to use my computer because it's this weird keyboard-driven thing that Noah has all his custom storage. It's just a mess. Same thing is true with my kids and my wife. They go to use the computer. Well, we can't use Dad's because it's this uncomplicated beast that is just difficult to wrap our minds around, right? Cosmic fixes all of that. When you want tiling, it's up in the corner. You click on the button, it turns it on. When you want to return to using the computer without tiling, you click on the button and it turns it off. And so it makes it very approachable for somebody who's never used tiling before in their life to give it a shot. And it also makes it appealing for people like me who have been living in i3 for the past year or so to say, I want to continue using a keyboard-driven workflow because I think that's a more efficient way to command a computer. And it turns out it is, and it turns out that System 76 based a lot of those keyboard shortcuts off of things like i3 and Sway. And so I feel right at home, but people that have not used a tiling desktop fit right at home. And what that tells me is System 76 has cracked this magic nut of a Linux distro that's inviting for a new user to use and yet still customizable and or powerful enough for the power user to feel at home as well. And in the pre-show discussion, we were talking a little bit about where do we see that landing between the Gnomes of the world, the KD Plasmas of the world, and the Cosmics of the world. How is all that going to shake out in the end? I obviously don't know the answer to that question, but I would speculate that if you're a new user and you've not used desktop Linux before, Cosmic is going to make you feel more at home from the standpoint that there are just less things to click on and less things to get confused by. You want to open a setting or you want to change something, it's all in one place, baby. You know, you take Plasma as an example. There's infinite ways to customize and fix Plasma. You can set it up any which way you want, no doubt about it. However, it also means that if you're a new user and you don't know what things to click on or what things not to click on or what things do what you want it to do, you might be searching for a hot minute until you find the exact button you're looking for. And I don't think that is the case with Cosmic. I think with Cosmic, when you could project onto a screen, plug into an external monitor, switch on tiling, switch off tiling, open up an application, switch between things, change a setting in your system, all of those things are laid out almost in like a Mac-like way. And so it's an alpha release, so you should set your expectations at this idea that it's not feature complete. There's going to be bugs. But if we are stewards that really care about the open source community, I think we have an obligation to go use stuff like this and right at this moment become System 76's harshest critic privately, right? I don't know that we need to be posting all over the internet, but giving them feedback, constructive feedback. Hey man, here's what works really well for me. Here's where I think your wins are. Here's where I think there's a bit of opportunity for growth. Is there any way that you would consider doing A, B, C, or D? I think that would really help me do whatever it is and help them wrap their mind over what the user is looking for. I think they're willing to do that. Quote, Cosmic is not only available for Pop! OS 2404, but also for any GNU Linux distribution that wants to offer their users, including Fedora Linux, OpenSUSE, Arch, SerpentOS, NixOS, as well as BSD and Redux platforms. Now here, get this. In addition to offering Cosmic Desktop for all of the major distributions and then some, its toolkit will also be available for Windows and Mac OS operating systems. So my best understanding of it today is Cosmic is not just a desktop environment, but also can serve as an application framework. Quote, however, Cosmic is currently offered as an alpha release, which means that there are bugs and known and expected, and features are incomplete. So do not, I repeat, do not go and download Cosmic and expect it to be a perfect experience on try one. However, do go download Cosmic, install it, drive it for a week or 2 or 3 or however long you can, and take the things that you learn, identify the paper cuts, and submit those back to System 76 so that they have an opportunity to get everything dialed in perfectly before their final release. Fedora, NixOS, Arch, OpenSUSE, Serpent, RedOx CachyOS. I think it's really, really awesome that not only is System 76 developing the desktop environment, not only are they making it for their own distro, and not only are they making it available for other distros, they went through the trouble. They bothered to go and post, for example, in the Arch AUR to make that desktop available there, and post in Copper for Fedora to make their desktop environment available over there. They went into those communities and said, here's a thing we built for you. It would have been easier to, and they could have, linked on system76.com/cosmic instructions on exactly how to do or how to install Cosmic on these individual distributions. Now that page exists. It has links that say see instructions, but when you click on them, it takes you to those projects home. To me, that's a sign that they're wanting to work within the community and do what is in the community's best interest, not just what's in their own best interest. We'll have the link for Arch linked in the show notes at podcast.asknoahshow.com. It's what I'm currently driving. And if you want to get Cosmic running on Arch Linux, you can do so. Roku has finally axed the Redbox app from its platform. Redbox parent company Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in June and moved to Chapter 7 in July, signaling that the liquidation of assets. However, the app has remained available, albeit not fully functional, in various places, leaving customers wondering if they'll ever be able to access their content that they bought. This development, however, mostly squashes any remaining hope of salvaging those purchases. So I bring this to your attention for a couple of reasons. I have said over and over and over again since episode 1 of this show that if you want something, that you should own it, and that you shouldn't be reliant on other people's services for a thing. When it comes to streaming content in specific, I find it wholly egregious that we quote unquote sell content to people that they pay for, believing that they own, when in fact that content never ever leaves the originating service. When you purchase something on iTunes or on Amazon or on Redbox, you don't own that content. You are granted a use license to be able to view that content so long as and in the way that the company who sold you the content says that you can. And if there's anything to be taken from this Redbox story, it is the following. When you purchase something on a service for which you have no control over, and that service goes away, you are owed nothing. This is not the first time this has happened. This happened with a user that had an iTunes account and purchased thousands of dollars, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of content on iTunes. And Apple shut down his iTunes account for whatever reason. And he went to court and said, but I own that content. And the answer back was, but you kind of don't, because it was obvious that it was only ever available to you via iTunes. So, for our family, we made the decision a long time ago, and have kind of dug in more so now, that we are going to take the money we would spend in streaming services. And oh, by the way, for those that say, well, but no, streaming services are a lot less expensive than they are. No, they're not. It is if you have one streaming service, right? But go talk to 5 of your friends and ask them how they do streaming services, and you will hear a story something along the lines of, well, we got Redbox for the adults to use, and we got Disney Plus for the kids to use, and we got Hulu for this, we got Disney. You'll have 7 different streaming services in one household. By the time you get done with that, you add up $12-15, whatever it is per streaming service. Take that money, the way our family has chosen to do that, we park that money in a bank account, and at the end of the year, we buy bigger hard drives, and we purchase content to rip and put on those hard drives to then watch back. You know how many times anybody has shut my streaming service off? Anova, a company that sells a smart sous vide cooker, is getting backlash from customers over announcing that it's soon going to charge a subscription fee for the device's companion app. Here's the catch. The companion app is 10 years old. Innova was founded in 2013 and sells sous vide immersion circulators. Its current third generation precision cooker 3.0 has an MSRP of $200. Innova also sends a $149 model and a $400 version that targets professionals. It debuted the free Innova Culinary app in 2014. The subscription fee will only apply to people who create an account after August 21st. Those who downloaded the app and make an account before August 21st won't have to pay, but everyone will have to make an account. Some people have been using the app without one until now. So if you are an avid Ask Noah Show listener and you're listening to this on August 20th as we air this episode live, and you have one of these godforsaken things, you can go create an account on your app, and then you won't have to pay the $2 a month. But if you wait until tomorrow, you're going to get charged $2 a month to use the app that's been available for 10 years. Now, in the company's defense, they have to find a way to monetize because people don't buy new appliances all the time. And so if you buy a sous vide cooker and it's still working for you, well, why would you upgrade? Answer, you wouldn't. So they're not making any money off of you by selling you a bigger and better product. Therefore, they have to find another way to monetize. Additionally, as was brought up by the company, it's costing them money for every person that installs the app and connects it to the internet because they're having to pay the back-end hosting infrastructure. Now, I would tell you that's their fault. Why did they launch a free app with an appliance without having a way to cover the costs of the app? That's kind of a silly thing to do. But that's the road they went down. So here we are. Again, it's another example of something you don't really own. Now, in this particular case, so far as I understand it, you can continue to use the sous vide cooker without the app. You just lose a bunch of the functionality. One of the things that came up in a Reddit post that I thought was kind of interesting, they asked the manufacturer, they asked the company, said, hey, instead of going this route, why don't you just open source the code? And there wasn't a warm reaction. But I have to tell you, as I kind of processed that in my mind, if I'm a company and I was so short-sighted that I developed an app that I don't know how to pay for, and I've now sold a bunch of these appliances that in order to take full advantage of which require an app that I didn't plan to pay for, and now I have to offload this onto my users, a $2 monthly fee is one way to solve that problem. But you know what a second way to solve that problem would be? Publish the communication protocols in the open and say, hey guys, here's this cooker that you bought. Here's the app. You don't know anything about software or don't care anything about software or just want to, by all means, pay us $2 a month and we will cloud service you up and we will deliver what you need. If, on the other hand, somebody wants to write, well, I don't know, a home assistant module or a self-hosted thing that runs a sous vide cooker or an app that you can run locally on your phone or a thing that you can run on your computer, I don't know. If that were an option, there are a number of people that would take advantage of it. Now, here's the deal. This is a bit of speculation on my part. I respectfully submit to you that anybody that was going to pay the $2 a month isn't going to not pay the $2 a month because there is an open source solution available. If you're the kind of person that just wants the thing delivered and the company says, give us $2 a month and we deliver it to you, you're not leaving any money on the table. Those people are still going to be your customers. Those people are still going to pay you. Here's where I think there's a bit of a blind sight in this approach. And the blind sight to this approach is I think they passed up an opportunity for their customers that wouldn't have paid them $2 a month, but rather would have went through the hassle and the trouble to self-host the thing. I think those people, many of whom got on the forums, on Reddit, elsewhere to say, you've lost a lifetime customer with me. I'm now going to become I'm going to make tearing down your company my new hobby and tell everybody that I know, family, friends, etc., not to buy your stupid thing because I had a thing and then you took away my free lunch. I had a thing, it worked with an app, and now you took it away from me and I feel slighted. Now again, Noah would tell you, you never owned that app to begin with. You never owned that tool to begin with. It was simply a kindness of the company to allow you to use it. But I think that's where they missed the mark. I think if they would have allowed the people who wanted to, the people who truly objected to it, to self-host and or open source a thing, I think they would have potentially sacrificed their reputation and you wouldn't have people super irritated.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of August 18th, 2024, here's the Linux and open source news. The retro gaming Linux distribution, Batacera, has released version 40. The Deepin team has announced Deepin 23, the culmination of 3 years of work, 9 iteration, and 51 internal tests. The Tails project has released version 6.6. Cockroach Labs shakes up its licensing of its distributed SQL database known as CockroachDB to force bigger companies to pay. Mesa 2402.0 is available as a new development release, implementing OpenGL 4.6 and Vulkan 1.3 APIs. Gentoo has announced that it is discontinuing support for IA64 Itanium CPUs. In open source AI news, the Open Model Initiative has joined orgs under the Linux Foundation's umbrella as it continues to push open standards for training and developing AI models. Artificial intelligence startup Lambda Incorporated and News Research has announced the launch of a new large language model called Hermes 3, which it says is a personalized, unrestricted version of Meta's open source Llama 3.1 model. And MIT scientists are detangling the brain with a new open source AI. Lars Gestby leads the Neuron Tracing and Active Learning Environment project, and an AI software pipeline that brings machine learning, supercomputing, as well as ease of use and access to this brain mapping challenge. Ultimately, the team's goal is to construct a network brain atlas, a detailed map of the human brain that can help relate structural information to the functions of neurons.
So, Steve, you have been working for some time now with Frigate. This started as a project itself, and it has devolved or evolved, depending on your definition, to a huge project at your house. Tell me how it's going with Frigate.
Yeah, so I wanted to back up and have a couple of make goods. So a couple of times that I've spoken about Frigate, I've had some little nitpicks about the UI or some functionality or some things like that. And some of it, turns out, shocker, was user error. So, for example, we talked about being able to scrub through the UI for various recordings and stuff like that. And I did not realize that web browsers don't handle H.265. I just never cared about that before. Wasn't a big deal. The other thing that I didn't realize was when I go to the Real-Link cameras, they just by default are doing something in the back end to detect like, hey, I'm not using the app, so give him the H.264 stream. And so when I would pull up the stream in the web browser, be like, oh, look, it works here, but it doesn't work in Frigate. I don't know what, like, I attributed that to a problem with the open source software, but in fact, what's happening is that magic that happens when you go to the Real-Link website has to be done by you. You have to define the fact that, hey, if I've got an H.265 stream, I need to transcode that so that I can watch that in the browser. I didn't understand that, so that's totally on me. Some of the other UI kind of niggles that I have I wouldn't say gone away, but they've definitely morphed because after the show last week, they released 0.14, which is a complete rewrite of their UI. And I like this UI a lot. It's very pretty. And some of the other things that I've spoke with people in the audience were things like user permissions are missing. Well, I haven't played with it, but user permissions exist now. You can actually go in and there are inside of the settings, there's a whole section for defining permissions and changing passwords and all that sort of stuff. Wasn't applicable to what I wanted because I just wanted open session, but that now exists. And the final thing I wanted to just give them a bump before we get into the deep dive is I went to the discussion forum because I had this weird problem. I have 6 cameras, and between the 6 cameras there are only 2 model numbers. 2 of my cameras do not work with this ffmpeg command to transcode the stream. The other 4 are fine. I could not for the life of me figure out what was going on. I pinged Noah. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. And between the two of us, we couldn't figure it out. So I went to the GitHub discussion section, and I honestly thought, I'm not going to get a response, right? Because they nest things like, hey, I'm here for help. Now I'm here for camera, and then sub for the type of camera that you're looking help for. And I was thinking, this is so many nested things. Nobody's going to respond to me. But turns out, nope. There was an active discussion that happened there. And while I didn't get a solution, I did work around the problem with the help of people in that discussion. So I was very impressed with the active community over there. So that's my make goods on Frigate. So if you'll allow me, I'll back up and start kind of describing what had transpired, because as you said, since Self, we've kind of been like piecemealing out a little bits of information about this project that I've undertaken. And I thought it might be a good time to actually summarize what I was doing, and what the journey has been so far. So what do you think about that?
100%. So I guess a couple of things. The H.265 thing has presented itself in kind of a unique way from the standpoint that it occupies less space. So we've had the discussion internally at Altispeed, and we're like, well, do we offer that to clients? And my answer time and time again has been no, because it won't work in the browser. Therefore, it will create all sorts of headaches for the clients that we suggest use Linux, right? And this is one of those things where I'm choosing to take the road less or the harder road to hoe, right? It'd be easier to just jump on board and go, look, the newer, modern, more compression algorithm that's available and delivers better quality for less storage. That is one way to go. And I've intentionally kept us off that path because it breaks Linux compatibility. And so there's a level of, I guess, frustration that when I hear the story of, well, they had this thing, but then they kind of hacked around the problem, and that's great if you're using their thing, but because it doesn't organically work and they don't expose that 264 stream, it causes problems for others.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of challenges here. So, and a lot of it came down to Steve was trying to take shortcuts. I didn't want to learn all the things about all the things. I wanted, like, my conception was, hey, I've got a bunch of cameras. I've already figured out how to pull them into Home Assistant. I'll just install this add-on, and then it will just record what it sees in Home Assistant. That was what my thought was. And I guess that's a good segue into kind of my project description.
Yes.
Right? So I've got 6 cameras around the house, and plus my doorbell. And the only one that natively supports a high resolution H.264 is the doorbell. And again, because of my lack of understanding, when I started first playing with Frigate, the only thing that worked was the doorbell. And I couldn't figure out why. And I'm, I had all of these problems, right? So I'm pulling all of these cameras in, and further to that, Home Assistant is doing some magic for me. I have no idea what it's doing, right? But the plugin that I installed, the Real-Link plugin that I installed, did the same magic that the web browser version did. And that's, again, part of my confusion, because I just installed the plugin and then I put a card and I see things on the card, right? And so I assumed that Frigate would work as easily. And again, I never looked into any of this sort of stuff, right? And I should have, because it turns out this project was a large project, not just in terms of the scale of what's happening, but we talk about hardware and all of the rest of that. So I was using a Intel NUC circa 2016 for my Home Assistant box, and it's been running perfectly fine. I started to get a little nervous several weeks ago before my camera adventures, because I've loaded so much stuff up onto this box that while it was not strained for resources, the fan was always going. And it's a little NUC, and if the fan dies, the thing's going to burn itself up. And you would walk up and you touch the box and it was warm. I wouldn't say hot, but it was warm all the time. And that made me nervous. And so I started putting I tried to install Frigate as an add-on, and my CPU just went crazy. Like, the fan going all the time turned into a jet engine is not fair, because, like, we're talking about like, I don't know, a 40 millimeter fan or something like that, tiny fan, but it was spinning all the time. So I thought, well, I will migrate this off to a box that I had sitting around. I had a Ryzen 1700 sitting around with 64 gigs of RAM, just kind of hanging out. I used it on and off for doing some AI stuff, and I just decided to repurpose it. So the very first thing that I attempted to do was I move it over to this new box and it's got cooling. I'm like, great. I've just like quadrupled my horsepower or more because I've moved from a circa 2016 NUC to a full-on desktop processor that's got, 8 cores and 16 threads. And so I started doing CPU decoding, right? After I started figuring out the fact that, hey, I need to actually do some transcoding to see things, which that took me an embarrassingly long period of time to figure that out. I was doing it on the CPU, and I would start doing my typical thing of I'm going to measure the power usage, right? And so I ended up doing this comparison of, well, if I run it on bare metal with a GPU versus if I run it in the Home Assistant without a GPU, because I didn't want to get into the situation of trying to pass in the only GPU in the box into a VM. I just didn't want to deal with that. And so I did a bunch of power stuff and decided like CPU decoding was probably the way to go until I scaled out the number of cameras that it was handling. And then it was a bad time. Like it was still functional, but now the CPU is, instead of pulling 80 watts, was pulling 100 watts, which was really close to what it was pulling if I was rendering it on the GPU on metal. Another thing that I learned, and again, people are going to be out there and they're going to be going, how did you not think of this, right? My job is to think about project planning and discover these pitfalls, but I didn't think of this. I was just running. So when I installed the add-on inside of Home Assistant, I was using the network attached storage function inside of Home Assistant to connect back to my NAS, because that's how I do my backups and some other stuff, right? And I didn't really think about the fact that I'm pulling in 6 streams, I'm recording them locally, and then I'm pushing them back to my NAS. And so it's effectively handling that stream at least twice, and 3 times if you actually have somebody watching the live stream, right? Because somebody's now watching a different stream on the camera. And that caused the Home Assistant UI to lag terribly. So this machine only has a 1 gig network. And so all of this led me to try running Frigate on bare metal. So I put a GTX 1060 in there so that it could handle the 6 streams that need to happen at the same time. And I still had this problem where the networking on the host was basically choking out the Home Assistant box, because I have 1 network card and 1 cable going to this box. So I didn't solve my problem. I thought I would mitigate it somewhat. Turns out not to be the case. So this project went from a little NUC with 16 gigs of RAM and a single hard drive to a full-blown desktop with 64 gigs of RAM. And before the show, I pulled my RAM stats for Noah. I'm using 75% of the RAM in this box as of the running of the show, just handling all of this stuff. And part of this is because Frigate wants to use TempFS for its recording segment. So by default, it wants to record off a segment every 10 seconds. And so it's, instead of giving you all that kind of IO, it's dumping it into TempFS as a faster way of handling it, right? So that if you're scrubbing or whatever, it makes sense. It's using the amount of RAM that's in the box, which I suppose is good, right? But at the end of the day, because of case fans and a bigger CPU and a GPU, my power usage went up. So then I had to think about, well, how am I going to mitigate the networking? And I started kicking around the idea of like, well, I could put a 10 gig NIC in this box. Where the box is, it's not really feasible to run a second 1 gig NIC and dedicate it to the VM, because I'd have to run another cable in the wall, right? Putting a switch between the cable coming out of the wall and the box isn't going to do anything, because the trunk is going to get saturated. So I started thinking about these things, and I thought, well, I do have these hard drives sitting on the shelf from a working pull. So I went and got these 4 terabyte hard drives and stuck them in this box. And then I started thinking about, well, if I'm going to make redundancy for the video files that I'm making, it's really stupid to not have redundancy on the VM images itself. So I went and got a pair of 512 SSDs. So now I've got an NVMe for the boot drive, dual 512 NVMEs for Home Assistant, and then these two 4 terabyte hard drives. So now I've went from 1 hard drive to 5 hard drives.
For a hobby project that solves a problem that you didn't have in the first place.
Exactly, right? So now the power is floating around 125 watts kind of steadily. And so I've septupled my power usage and my disk and this one completely got away from me.
And there's got to be an upside, Steve. Have you learned anything kind of cool? Have you stumbled into anything that you're like, well, actually, though, on the other side of it?
Well, so I did like a lot of things about what you can do with Frigate. So one of the neat things that I started playing around with immediately was tying this into Home Assistant. And I hear you saying, well, duh, like, isn't that the whole point? Well, hear me out. What you can do is any Home Assistant event can be used to trigger an event in Frigate. And what that means is, so when there's an event and you're scrubbing through the timeline, it puts a little marker there. Not only does it put a little marker there, there's specific thumbnails on kind of a loop, sort of like a GIF, in your interface that it tracks for every one of the events. And so it makes it really easy to find things like, hey, I've got 24 hours. At what point did somebody ring the doorbell on this thing, so that you can skip through it? Because again, I'm bypassing the additional work of having Frigate do any kind of detection, because that can be really intensive. So I'm using Home Assistant that already has this sort of stuff that triggers events. So for example, Home Assistant consumes the camera. The camera is able to detect whether it's a person, a vehicle, or an animal. And then you can do motion. You can do a period of time. Like, there's a bunch of things that you can do because Home Assistant's getting these sensors from the camera. And you can, via an API call, push these into Frigate to set up these kind of custom events. And this is really neat because these are inside of the Frigate UI. These are called alerts. And there's an entire page of alerts that you can just go and look, and it'll tell you how long ago the alert was. And you can see the, basically it's just a giant spreadsheet of all of the alerts that have happened in whatever time frame you filter. And one of the other things that I really liked about Frigate that I didn't even consider was when you're going back and you're reviewing your timeline, if you pick one and you scrub through it, it actually puts somewhere else on the UI depending on the resolution of the camera that you're looking at. So I'm looking at my doorbell right now. To the right of the doorbell are the other 5 feeds. So when I scrub through the UI, it actually shows you all of the other cameras at that time as you're scrubbing through the UI. And it's just kind of a nice thing. For us, that's not really important in our use case, but I could 100% see someone wanting to be able to see the driveway and the doorbell and the backyard at the time that you're scrubbing through the UI. And so there's a lot of stuff to really, they've done a really good job after we got by Steve's ignorance.
Well, I get what you're skating at insofar as the information's available online. If you were so passionate enough to dig in, you could. But at the same time, to a degree, projects are only as usable as they are approachable, right? And so even if the information is there, if it's not readily obvious or readily apparent, if it bit you, it's likely going to bite others. And I guess this would be this is my takeaway, having heard your experience and actually having seen like at least the first maybe third of it in person. Do you think that there is a point at which open source overtakes the proprietary thing? So, and then it gains enough momentum that it's just uncatchable, and it becomes the, Nginx of the world as opposed to the Windows IIS. And my 1B to that is, do you think we're there yet with NVRs, open source NVRs with Linux? Or do you think it's possible to accomplish the tasks, but you're doing so with some trade-offs?
I would say we're definitely not there from my limited experience, just because the setup was rough. Not only was the setup rough for me, and I'm not even talking about all the silly mistakes that I made here. I'm referring all the way back to the problem itself, right? All those stuff we bumped into. So when I went back and I started searching for some of these errors, I actually were finding people posting on their GitHub issues things like, hey, I made a guide for how to actually get this working. And I found 2 or 3 posts where different people had linked out to their own blogs about how they actually got Frigate up and running on bare metal, which was what I was trying to do. And so that indicates to me the documentation might have the information there, but it definitely wasn't approachable enough for the average person. If, I struggled through it and then several other people felt the need to write a guide and then open up a GitHub issue and link to their guide, that tells me that the style of documentation wasn't speaking to the general audience. Whereas, with some of the other stuff, it almost is like, hey, I take it out of the box, I plug in some cables, and there's a little manual, but it's pretty straightforward as to what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think we're there yet. Will it overtake? It could, and here's where I'm thinking that my tax consultant, she was complaining about her camera setup and how it's being put into the cloud and it's got all these problems and all this sort of stuff. And I was telling her, hey, like, I've been kind of experimenting with this. It might be interesting for you to see this. And she was interested in that because she likes the idea of having the box right there. Like, I know the files are stored here and I can bring it up in my web browser and scrub through it, whatever, all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And as we've talked about, there's no licensing fee. There's no problem pulling in various types. Like, you could even pull in web cameras if you wanted to, which you may not be able to do with some proprietary system. Mm-hmm. You have to bring the know-how, though. And that's where the challenge is, I think.
100%. In my experience, what oftentimes tends to happen is you get those things dialed in and they're a huge pain up front where you find where all the bones are buried and you learn how to work around them. And then you get something dialed in. And sometimes it's a mixture of finding the right brands. Sometimes it's a fixture of picking out the right features. Sometimes it's looking for the right compatibility. Based on my experience watching you and then hearing how that has all played out for you, my impression is it's absolutely there today. If your goal is you want to bring all some cameras into a central place and view them, when you want that solution to scale or when you want to place that into sort of any sort of complicated environment, there's going to be there's going to be more than a few key features that are just yet to get there. But this is the first step, right? There are professional NVR solutions on Linux like ZoneMinder. They just leave a little bit to be desired in the way of an interface. And so with Frigate, it has a great interface. It's just missing some of the buttons that will eventually, I believe, someday land there.
I think that it's getting... So this is a 0.14 release, right? They haven't even declared this as a 1.0 or anything near that.
Doesn't even technically exist yet.
So there are a bunch of features that I thought were really, really nice. And maybe these exist other places. But for example, the export button, it allows you to pick the amount of time, right? 4 hours, 8 hours, 1 hour, whatever, or a custom. And then you can even do like, hey, give me a time lapse. And you can tell it, spit me out a time-lapse export. And I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, and kind of a fun thing to be able to go back and like, hey, let me watch me clean the garage or do that project that I forgot to set up a camera recorder before thing or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, it's neat. I thought, there's a bunch of stuff where it's like, this is legitimately a neat project, and I could see it getting there. But as with everything, I wouldn't even say it's early days from the perspective, like early days makes it sound buggy.
Right.
Turns out the bugs were me, not the software, largely. I like I said, I alluded to a problem that we could not solve, but we worked around. I don't know where the problem is. Essentially what's happening is those 2 cameras that were giving me the problem, the FFmpeg command still doesn't work. It like randomly will pick one of those 2 cameras to randomly tell me like I couldn't get a frame. Not just I couldn't get a frame, but like it tries enough and then crashes. Like the FFmpeg process just dies on it. And so the solution there was to go connect to the lower resolution stream that comes out of the camera, and then it's stable. That's not ideal, right? That is a bug. But aside from that, all of my other nitpicks, turns out that the bug was me. So
do you think once you get it dialed in, it's possible to share so it doesn't become tribal knowledge in Steve's head? Or is it a function of we just need better documentation, and or it's going to be so dependent on the equipment that you're using and the configuration that you're using and what you're desiring to get out of it that it's not really possible to share the knowledge, so to speak?
I think that I wouldn't have the ability to pass the knowledge on because I still don't have a good grounding on this. It's kind of like a person who's banging away in Bash and just goes to the internet and says, how do I do this in Bash? And then cuts and pastes. Well, that doesn't work. Like, that's essentially what I did to get to the spot where I'm at. So I have some understanding more of what I'm doing, but what I discovered from going to the GitHub discussion was the bits can be there. You just have to know to go, for example, like I didn't know that I had to go look into the Go to RTC stream section to actually go grab the sub feed for those two problem cameras. I had no idea. And then when I got to that section, I'm like, oh, look, there's a bunch of stuff here that I didn't know about. Right. And so I'm not at a spot. I could tell you what I did, but that's not going to tell you much more because, again, I just kind of hunted around until I stumbled over the thing. Now I have my configuration, and I kind of like save that and just hope that it never burns up on me, so I don't have to
magic
recreate
config,
it.
Steve. It's a magic config. I love it. Awesome. Well, hey, I appreciate you taking the time to kind of share. So, is it an ongoing project? Is it something you're going to continue with, or if you feel like you have exhausted / engaged in enough masochism for one lifetime?
No, you know what? I'm going to keep it around. Like I said, once we figured out that this was okay, I sent it to my wife, and she's kind of looked at it like she's made some requests like, hey, this one was too grainy, or by default, for example, the preview screens are 10 frames per second. She's like, it's choppy. Fix that. You know, like, so getting feedback and then figuring out how to tweak it. She's been okay with it. I like what I've seen and how I can integrate with it. So it'll hang around.
If I wanted to buy a box, hindsight being 2020, if I was going to buy a box and let's say I wanted to do 4 cameras, is there a box that you would say, here's something you could purchase off of the shelf and use that isn't, you know, what did we wind up with, 64 gigs of RAM, something like that? Is there something less that could be picked off the shelf and used, do you think?
Sure, there is. So you could, part of your RAM calculation, and they actually give you like a Python one-liner to help you calculate the amount of RAM that you think that you'll need based on the streams and all that sort of stuff. I'm pulling in and saving large files. Like these are 4K cameras, and I'm not downgrading the resolution on them. I'm transcoding them. I'm sure there's some bit loss there, but I'm not doing anything aside from that. So that means that, that brings me to another interesting thing, just as an aside. They have a live metrics thing in their page, and it actually calculates things like how much each piece is using for GPU and CPU memory, as well as, you know, general memory on the box. But the other thing that it'll do is it'll tell you how much disk space you're using and what you're predicted to be using per hour or per day. And I thought that was a pretty neat touch, because you can kind of per stream, like it breaks it down per stream and says, you know, this stream is using 3.6 gigs per hour, and you can kind of figure out how much storage it's going to cost you to do that. And I thought that was kind of neat. So all of that to say is, to pare down a box, you don't need 64 gigs of RAM. Part of this is I went with ZFS, and that's using, I have 2 mirror pools, one for my VMs and one for the camera. And because of that, my arc is crazy big, because I'm writing like crazy for the video. So if you just went with a single hard drive and some regular sane file system, then you're not going to have nearly the RAM usage that I am. Also, 16 gigs of what I'm using is going to my Home Assistant box, because I'm running, I think we've run down the list before, but I'm running an obscene number of things. Like I have ESP Home, and I've got go to RTC and I've got Grafana and Hax and Influx and Node-RED and Tailscale and Zigbee to MQTT and, whatever. The list goes on. So part of this is I have a stupid amount of things happening on my box.
Kitchen sink add-on, so to speak.
Yeah. Yep.
Very good. So what would you leave people with? People are listening and they say, hey, I'm interested in playing with it. I am interested in a solution. Would you tell them go for it? Would you say let it bake for a little bit longer? Would you say it's okay as long as you're willing to, be ready to do some, as Simon likes to say, some cowboy setup?
I think I would say go for it. Don't put it on the same box as Home Assistant for networking concerns. And definitely not the same box if you can't afford to separate the disks. Like, I'm not sure how much I would be beating up on the Home Assistant UI experience if they were sharing the same disks, for example. So if you're cautious about separating church and state and don't do what I did, I'd say go for it.
I tell you, my first foray into this, I think, is going to be, we have clients all the live long day that we pitch a security solution to and they go, yep, I really like it, but price, cost, this, that, and the other. And I think that's where this is going to have its inroads. There are plenty of people that don't need all the fancy features. What they need is be able to pull up footage, download it, see what's going on. And I think Frigate is just about there now. I'm confident they will get there by 1.0. And I think that will be a really nice, easy win for a completely open source NVR with a modern, sleek interface and mobile app access. Music in my ears means we're out of time. I thank you for joining us. We record the show live every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. You can join us live by going to AskNoahShow.com. Didn't catch the show? That's fine. It's all available on repeat. The entire back catalog is available at podcast.asknoahshow.com. There you'll find not only links to all of the past episodes, but you'll find all of the articles and references we used to make the show. You want to keep the date up to date on the latest, follow us on X. I'm at Colonel Linux. He's at Linux Ovens. The show at Ask Noah Show. We're back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com.